Welcome to the Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we'll be exploring the Exodus from an esoteric understanding as explored in my book, The Exodus and Beyond, Book 2 of Unlocking the Dream Vision. In this video, we'll take our first look at the invasion and settlement of the Holy Land. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. Although the esoteric idea that the modern-day nation of Iran could be the true location of the ancient land of Canaan may seem strange, it will, in time, explain several of the mysteries of the ancient world. Our starting point for this part of our journey is just before the Bronze Age collapse and the numerous tribes that we know moved into the area of the Iranian Plateau, also known as the Persian Plateau, and the countless valleys of the Zagros Mountains. We know very, very little about the ancient tribes that settled in the areas between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, in which is now the far northwestern parts of Iran. We do not know where they came from. We don't know what language they spoke, and historians have proposed numerous different theories about their origins and who these people actually are, with many believing that they came from the southern parts of Russia around the northern parts of the Caspian Sea. However, the truth is, there's just no evidence where these people actually came from. Historically, they literally just kind of seem to pop out of nowhere onto the Iranian plateau. Historically, scholars have called these mysterious people that settled this area and the Zagros Mountains as the Proto-Indo-European people. Although we don't know where these people came from, we do know that once these people arrived on the Iranian plateau, they quickly displaced, subdued, or oppressed the people that were already living there very quickly. As with not knowing where these people originally came from, we also do not know what language these people spoke, nor do we know what racial or ethnic group they belonged to. However, it is suspected that they were made up of many different ethnic groups and tribes that all lived in and around the Fertile Crescent and were not actually any one particular group of people. We also know that once they had settled the Iranian plateau and the valleys of the Zagros Mountains, their numbers quickly grew. Over the centuries, they slowly moved out into the surrounding areas, and in the process, they became the people that we now know as the Indo-European. Since these Proto-Indo-European and these later Indo-European people are not made up of one single group of people, single culture or racial groups, scholars tend to identify them through the common language they are believed to have spoken and the common linguistic terms that they used. This Proto-Indo-European language is believed to be the mother tongue of almost all modern-day languages. It has also been one of the primary methods that historians have used to trace these Indo-European people down through the ages. Since there is little to no archaeological evidence for these people, almost everything we know about them comes from the languages, cultures, and mythologies that came from later daughter cultures that were descended from them. It is important to remember that we are speaking of a large, diverse group of people made up of many different tribes, cultures, customs, and languages that we identify through the common language that they spoke. This common tongue, known as the Proto-Indo-European language, and then later the Indo-European language group, as they began to spread out from the Iranian plateau. Although the origin of these ancient people that invaded and settled the Iranian plateau thousands upon thousands of years ago is a complete mystery to modern scholars, we can begin understanding with our new esoteric knowledge that these mysterious Proto-Indo-European people that seem to appear out of nowhere on the Iranian plateau just before the Bronze Age collapse are most likely the ancient Hebrews or Israelites that the Bible speaks of with their arrival and settlement of the ancient land of Canaan. This idea may seem outrageously radical at the moment, but as we learned with our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch as a whole, It only takes one or two small pieces of information to radically change our understanding of the entire story. Our first step in understanding this radical idea that the ancient Israelites spoken of in the Bible are the people we know historically as the Proto-Indo-European people, and combine it with our esoteric knowledge of the dream vision that the Exodus continued on after the tribes had crossed a stream of water under the leadership of the legendary and mythological divine twin brothers. Then that sheep, their leader, which had become a man, withdrew from them and fell asleep, and all the sheep sought it and cried over it with a great crying. And I saw till they left off crying for that sheep and crossed that stream of water. And there arose the two sheep as leaders in place of those which had led them and fallen asleep. Book of Enoch, chapter 89, verses 38 and 39. As we will discover, this radical idea combined with these verses from the Dream Vision of Enoch will allow us to understand the hidden story of the great exodus out of Egypt by the Israelites contained within the Bible. It will also allow us to trace the movements through history and around the world in a way you never imagined it before. Our next step starts during the wandering of the Israelites through the wilderness. During this time, the Bible tells us that the 12 tribes of Israel conquered an unknown number of other tribes and people as they encountered them during their wanderings in the wilderness. The Bible also details how the armies of the tribes of Israel would kill every man, woman, and child except the virgin women and the very, very young girls that had never known a man, every single time they came into conflict during this time in the wilderness. This helped to vastly increase their numbers, but it also introduced new words, custom, and cultural elements into the culture of the different tribes. Over time, this influx of new words and their just common need to communicate with each other would naturally lead to these different tribes all coming up with an entirely new language or common tongue. It is this common tongue that these people created to speak with one another that becomes the language we call the Proto-Indo-European, the mother tongue of all languages today. However, at the same time, each tribe would keep speaking their original language among themselves that they spoke before they joined with the other tribes. This new common language of the tribes would naturally influence the original tribal languages, transforming them into entirely new languages over time as they wandered around the wilderness. This is a critical clue that the wandering in the wilderness and the later second part of the Exodus had to have occurred over a much more extensive amount of time than the 40 years recorded in the biblical story. Because as we know in modern scholarship, because it usually takes many generations for multiple languages to fuse and transform into a new one. The Bible tells us that once this first generation that had rebelled against their Lord had passed away, their numbers had grown large. These children of Israel returned to enter the ancient land of Canaan by force. The Bible also tells us that after the tribes conquered the land of Canaan, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, together with about half the tribe of Levi, settled in this land of Canaan. According to the book of Joshua, once this initial settlement was complete, the other tribes continued on with the exodus to the lands each tribe had inherited by the casting of lots, which according to the Dream Vision of Enoch and our esoteric knowledge occurred under the leadership of these divine twin brothers. By understanding where the ancient land of Canaan was actually located, and the Israelites of the Bible are actually the people we call the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and the tribes and the people that settled these lands, we can begin understanding that the later immigration, invasion, and settlement of the Indo-European people are the other tribes of Israel as they move to their inherited lands under the leadership of these twin brothers. As we continue deeper into this esoteric story and understanding, we'll learn that these twin brothers of myth and legend are the next step to understanding how these Israelites moving to their inherited lands and the migration of the Indo-European speaking people of history are actually one and the same. We'll also discover how the second phase of the Exodus is directly connected to the Bronze Age collapse of civilization and how it became the political, social, and religious foundation that will become the civilizations of the classical ancient world. For many, even with our symbolic understanding of the knowledge of the Dream Vision of Enoch, this revelation may be slightly hard to believe for many that the Israelites of the Exodus and the Proto-Indo-European speaking people of the ancient world are one and the same. As radical as this idea may be, as we go farther in the story, you will discover that if we combine this idea with the legends and mythology of the twin brothers, we can actually trace their movements around the world and combine it with the migration of the Indo-European people. Not only can we trace the movements, but we also will learn how they assimilated the existing local pantheon of gods into their own, and then transforming them both into a new religious system that incorporated elements of both. During this process, we'll also learn how they constructed some of the original religious belief that these children of Israel brought with them. We'll also learn the secrets of what happened to the tribes that settled in the land of Canaan. For us to understand how these different and conflicting ideas fit together and how they are connected to events that unfold in the land of Canaan, we must first start with the second phase of the Exodus under the leadership of the divine twin brothers, as each tribe moved into their individual lots of land. By realizing that the ancient Israelites of the Exodus are the Proto-Indo-European people that later become the Indo-European people, we can easily understand from history that the first lands that these Indo-European people or Israelites entered into was the Indus Valley to the south. History remembers these people as the Indo-European Aryan-speaking tribes that appear to have come in several waves into the Indus Valley that occurred over many centuries. And strictly speaking, Aryan is a purely linguistic term like Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European. It does not refer to any one people or any one racial group. It is used to help identify the different tribes that came through the Hindu Kush that washed deeper and deeper into the Indus Valley and the Punjab, eventually reaching the upper Ganges River, that all spoke the same Indo-European language that we call Aryan. Scholars and historians believe that this language is the original language that gave birth to the Sanskrit language. There is also the additional twist to the story that this first wave of tribes to appear in the Indus Valley were in fact not Aryan-speaking Indo-Europeans, but they were in fact the tribes that had been displaced and then pushed out of the lands north of the Indus Valley, the land of Canaan, as these Indo-Europeans or Israelites began settling it. Historically, these Aryan-speaking people moving into the Indus Valley has been viewed as some type of invasion. However, we now know that it was not really a violent invasion. It was more of a slow settlement with fits of violence that eventually led to a complete political takeover of the Indus Valley. Remarkably, the settlement of these Indo-European people in the Indus Valley follows the same pattern that we saw in Egypt with the Hyksos. As these Aryan-speaking tribes first moved into the Indus Valley's pastoral lands, they first encountered local tribes that were very similar to themselves and that were already established in the area and on the surrounding lands. Once the Aryan numbers had grown large enough from these first small settlements, they started taking over the local tribes just as they had done in Egypt. As with Egypt, these Aryan-speaking tribes would normally only remove the tribes or small villages' leadership and replace them with their own. They would begin assimilating the people into their tribe while allowing the local people to keep their same religious beliefs, customs, culture, and language. The only real change that occurred for the average commoner was that their religious leaders and places of worship were relocated back to the central area where the ruling class of Aryans were settled at. Although this settlement is similar to what occurred in Egypt, the archaeological evidence shows us that unlike Egypt, the existing Bronze Age civilization known as a Hapara appears to have already been in a slow state of collapse when these Aryan-speaking tribes first began arriving in the valley. It is unknown why this civilization of the Indus Valley was collapsing at this point. It's possible that the earlier waves of refugees from the settlement of the ancient land of Canaan to the north had put incredible stresses upon this existing civilization. It's equally possible that it was due to changes in rainfall or changes in the Indus River that this civilization depended upon. Nevertheless, just as equally possible that some other factor like prolonged warfare or disease even led to its collapse. Ultimately, in the end, it matters little why the Haparan civilization was collapsing, because it quickly crumbled once the Aryan-speaking tribes began their migration deeper into the valley. There's also little doubt that much violence marked this coming of the first tribes, for these Aryan-speaking tribes were nomadic warriors with horses, chariots, with a mixture of advanced bronze and some iron weapons. There is also ample evidence that once these Aryans had taken over, the native people lived side by side peacefully with their new arrivals, keeping their own beliefs, customs, and practices alive. Although there are many examples of the locals and the Aryans living peacefully, archaeologists have found puzzling evidence that many other tribes and city-states of the Indus Valley were either abruptly abandoned or completely destroyed. While archaeology and the scholars may find this evidence puzzling, we can quickly recognize that it's the same pattern we first encountered in Egypt with the Hyksos. We will also see a similar pattern unfold once these Aryans had gained a solid foothold in the Indus Valley and began to reorganize the local pantheon of gods. As we saw in Egypt, as these Aryan-speaking Indo-European people began their settlement of the Indus Valley, we see the same common features that is unique to these people and how they settled an area when they moved into a new land. As we've already started to learn, when these Indo-European tribes began moving into a new land as they did in Egypt, they did not arrive as one large group, but came slowly in small groups, most likely in individual clans or very small tribes. The first step was obviously to gather intelligence on the area and the people who lived there, just as they had with the land of Canaan, as we're told in this book of Deuteronomy with Moses and the spies. This information would then allow the tribes to pick the most promising area with just a few tribes that were very similar to themselves in order to establish a solid foothold and a base of operations. Once this was accomplished, a second wave would begin entering the area into the surrounding lands. This stage of the settlement appears to be a time of much violence in the Indus Valley as the Aryan tribes begin to take over the surrounding tribes and small villages. Once they had taken over enough villages and small communities that allowed them to have established a solid foothold with a very strong central base of operations, they began to challenge the city-states that made up the Haparan civilization for their political and military control of the surrounding lands. As the city-states were being conquered and or destroyed, a third wave would begin to arrive. This would consist of the remaining tribes with their women, children, livestock, which would then help establish control of the surrounding lands that the original tribes had first settled. After they established themselves, their political power was secure, the Indo-European or Israelite tribe that was to inherit that land would then take control of it. Once they were firmly in control, the other tribes would begin moving to the next area where they would then repeat this same process. Once the main body of tribes had moved on, the remaining tribe that had inherited the land would begin their unique process of settlement and assimilation and fusion into the native population. This assimilation normally took the form of them removing and replacing any of the remaining elites of the local area with their own, normally through intermarriage by this time, but while also rearranging the local pantheon of gods. As they began rearranging the pantheon of gods, they would take great care to slowly change it and the existing belief system so that it would be acceptable to the lower classes that made up most of the population. To understand how they accomplished this cultural and religious change, we must take a more in-depth look at the local population of the Indus Valley that was taken over by the Aryans during the settlement. As we saw in Egypt with the Hyksos, once the Aryan tribes had gained a solid foothold, they would begin slowly taking over the surrounding lands, tribes, villages, and small communities that were closest to this primary area of settlement. This population growth of the Aryans is actually a combination of them taking over the surrounding communities and the arrival of their fellow tribesmen coming into the area. Once their numbers had grown large enough and they began to take over enough land, they would begin challenging the city-states throughout the valley. What happened to each of these different communities was directly dependent on whether the people resisted the Aryan-speaking tribes or not. If the city-states welcomed them and the elites of that community swore allegiance to the leadership of the Aryans, then next to nothing would happen to them or the local people. The only real change would be that as several family members of the ruling class would be relocated to the central area of settlement. This was done to ensure their loyalty and that they would honor their oaths to their new Aryan rulers. The Aryans would also settle a large group of their own people into the area, which would also help to ensure that the local elites in the population would follow the wishes of the new Aryan overlords. The only other real change that would occur was that the local religious cult center and its priest would also be relocated back to the central area of settlement of the Aryan rulers. If the community resisted the Aryans but quickly surrendered without much of a fight, then the Aryan tribes would usually only kill the elites, who would then be replaced with local Aryans or people that were loyal to the Aryans. They would then also remove approximately half the native population back to the central area of settlement. These people would then be replaced with an equal number of people from either Aryan tribes or from other tribes that were loyal to them. Remarkably, in both situations, very little of anything else would change for the common people that made up these communities. Their religious beliefs, their customs, and practices would be left more or less intact by their new rulers, with only the local cult center of the community and the priests being located back to the main settlement of the Aryans. If the elites of the community resisted and the common people of the lower classes did not, for example, if a city-state met them on the battlefield and once their army had lost, after the battle, the Aryans would kill the entire army and any and all remaining elites without mercy. Then they would depopulate the entire city-state, moving all the lower classes back to the central area of settlement and then turning a great number of them into slaves. Although the city-state would normally be abandoned, it was not uncommon for the Aryans or those loyal to the Aryans to then occupy the city-state once the local population had been removed. If the city-state continued to resist the Aryans after being defeated on the battlefield, with the Aryan tribes having to lay siege to the city-state, then no mercy of any kind was shown once the walls of the city had been breached. The Aryans would kill every man, woman, child in the city, leaving the bodies where they fell, sparing only the young female virgins to be taken as wives. After they had slaughtered the entire population, they would then loot the city of any items of value. And then they would destroy it, normally by fire, and then abandon the site forever. The famous ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro is one of the best examples showing what have happened to a city-state in the Indus River Valley whose population had resisted the Aryan tribes. Within its ruins, we find the gruesome evidence that the entire population was slaughtered, with the bodies left in the streets where they fell. There's also ample evidence that the entire city was looted, with much of it being destroyed by fire, within the site being entirely abandoned forever. Although the Happaran civilization collapsed under the weight of the Aryans, we have ample amounts of archaeological evidence that the assimilation and fusion of Happaran culture with the Aryan had a massive influence on everybody, and that would later influence the culture and religion known as Hinduism. This also brings us close to our first steps into the second phase of the Exodus. In our next video, we will take our first serious look on how these beliefs of the Aryans combined with the beliefs of the Hoparans laid the foundations of one of the world's greatest religions, Hinduism, including its rigid social system that we call caste. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.